some philosophical insight, and today we're going to take 15 minutes to talk about the struggle over culture and the influence of formal cause within that struggle. If you want to know more about me, who I am, the work I do, continuum, there are some relevant links below where you can find out a pretty good amount of information. Now, I haven't done a video in a while, or a recording in a while, and I've hesitated over doing this particular recording for some time. And the reason for this is I think some people may take it the wrong way. And in order to try and minimize misunderstandings, I've tried to be very careful in selecting my language. As you might be able to tell by the title, Kulturkampf, I'm dealing with the notion of cultural struggle. That's what the term literally translates into. But for a long time, the more common phrase has been, in English at least, culture war. I have no desire to participate in a culture war. But as someone living within a culture, however, I do believe it is inevitable that I, and you, and everyone else, willingly or not, consciously or not, that everyone does participate in the struggle over culture. Now, you might be wondering what's going on with this quote-unquote seeming quibbling over semantics. Well, before I get to the semantics themselves, the difference between struggle and war, I have to say that I have never accepted as legitimate the objection that one is quibbling over semantics. Words and their meaning are important. They signify concepts, and concepts are that on the basis of which all human history, all history that is truly human, that is, has unfolded. If you don't think words are important, you should probably stop listening to me speaking them. In fact, it seems to me that the objection over quibbling over semantics presumes a nominalist, or at least idealist, divorce between cognitive activity and things independent of cognitive activity. But pursuing that question in particular would take us fairly far off track. So, to get back onto the semantics of struggle and war, I protest use of the latter term because it suggests an entirely inapt, unfitting metaphor. War, to be waged justly, must have a reasonable expectation of victory and a justified means of carrying it out. Now, one adopts violent means out of necessity, the need, namely, to produce or restore an orderly way of life that allows human beings to pursue their natural and fitting goods. War should be irregular. And before anyone thinks about bringing it up, let me say that there's an entirely different way in which the concept of spiritual warfare or spiritual combat must be understood, which would, entered into fully, take us into a discussion well outside the boundaries of a culture war or a cultural struggle. Very succinctly, just to sort of allay any potential half-cocked objections, succinctly, I would say that there are conditions for decisive victory in matters of the spiritual soul of the human being, but not so in matters of culture, which is, by nature, an intrinsically, temporally unfolding suprasubjective reality, constituted through a pattern of relations which attains a new foundation in every human being who is born and reared within a society of other human beings. Or, in other, simpler words, culture is an ever-present and ever-developing reality which can only exist through the exchanges human beings have with one another. It is never final. There is no final form of culture, because we human beings, as existing on Earth, are not ever actually final. We, by nature, are creatures that change both over the course of our individual lives and over the course of generations. So let me proceed here by way of an anecdote. And it's one that I've told a few times before in different contexts, so you may have heard it before. But when I taught ethics at the Wentworth Institute of Technology, which is a secular school in Boston, Massachusetts, I started each semester by giving the students a note card, or an index card, on which to write their names, email addresses, a hobby or interest, and in a single sentence or less, something they believe to be wrong with the world today, with the attached promise that I would give my own answer later in the semester. I would say that their answers ranged from the very thoughtful, and ones that clearly had been thought about before, to the kind you'd expect in a caricature of a beauty pageant. Most were focused on what could be called systematic societal issues. Issues such as poverty or systematic inequality, abuse of power, racism, hatred, gender-based ideological discord, the lack of charity or honesty among people as a whole, and so on and so forth. Now, throughout the semester, we read a variety of thinkers. David Hume, J.L. Mackie, John Stuart Mill, Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, Philippa Foot, Marilyn Frye, and quite a few others. Now, each in some way among these varied thinkers provides some kind or another of systematic approach to ethics as a whole, or at the very least with regard to some specific problem, a rule or set of principles which, if followed, promise that society will be made better. Now, there might be rather loose principles or rules, or they might be rather strict ones, but I think all of them had in mind the same goal, despite the sometimes rather important differences in their means. Now, mind you, in teaching this course, I was required to provide a survey course covering a broad range of thinkers and theories. Ideally, when I've taught at other schools, I'd prefer to focus the course more intently on better thinkers, but the conditions of my employment there were not negotiable. At any rate, being required to teach a wide range of theories and thinkers, I endeavored most of the semester to show how these proposed systems have intrinsic flaws, how they fail, how they do not and cannot provide us with a secure and ethical society, and how they may, in consequence, be overcome or abused. Towards the end of the semester, we would read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, after book one of which I would read their answers as to what's wrong with the world back to them. They always remembered my promise that it was now my turn to answer that very same question. So, what's wrong with the world? I would ask myself out loud in the front of the class. Me, I would answer. I am. Now, you might recognize this answer, which has been shamelessly pilfered from a legend about G.K. Chesterton, and freely admit that I lifted it from that legend. He did write a book, after all, titled What's Wrong with the World, in which he answers a lot more than that. But it is, I believe, stolen or not, a good teaching tool. Yes, there are many systematic problems with our country, our world, our politics, and our culture. But I cannot control any of those problems. I can try to change them, but I cannot control them. For each one of those problems depends upon millions, if not billions, of human wills which are not my own. I am by nature in control only of myself, and even that only to a limited degree. I cannot will myself, for instance, to be something I naturally am not and am not capable of, as I cannot will myself to be a top-tier athlete. Maybe a decent one, but genetically such elite athletic skill has always been out of my grasp. Nor can someone, for that matter, born a man, will himself to become a female, however much they might want to, and however much technology might allow them to live out the fantasy. It's just not a possible thing. Now, the circumstances into which we are all born are beyond our control. It is our genes, our location, and many other things. But what is in our control is our capacity for virtue, the decisions and choices that we as individuals make. Naturally, this control, this capacity for virtue, decisions, and choices extends, in some ways, into those with whom we have close relations. That is, our individuality as persons is only relative, and we ourselves are constituted largely through the relations which we have with other persons. Now, the faculty of the will, nevertheless, extends efficaciously only to the self. We cannot will things for individuals other than ourselves, even if we are in our individuality constituted through relations with them. So we may influence others through a kind of formal causality, known as objective or specifying causality to be precise, which is just what I was attempting to do with those students, showing them the truth through a careful, painful, difficult process, one class session, one reading, one assignment, one Socratic hour at a time. But we cannot control their wills. Now, it's in this inability to control others and the difficulty of showing the truth in which the struggle over culture consists. It is a perennial struggle. It occurs again and anew with each individual human being who grows up in this or any other society. Believing that there could ever come into existence a society where the demonstration of what is true is not difficult, where the struggle for truth does not recur on a daily basis, is a fantasy which obscures the truth of the matter. There are no shortcuts. The effect of specifying formal causality does not and cannot occur on a cultural scale through the impositions of force. It is a gradual process of habituation, and one which, to produce good results for a human being, requires careful attention. I would say that I had a relatively decent amount of success teaching my ethics course in persuading students to think that Aristotle and his approach to virtue was a very good starting point for how to behave ethically, to recognize that claim as true, in other words. But that was only because it was small classes of no more than 22 students at a time. That's not to say that a larger class could not have been likewise persuaded in some way, but that persuasion, for it to have reached the majority of the class, at the very least, would have been some way superficial, producing only a fleeting conviction birthed through rhetorically winning the moment, through presenting them probably a kind of fictionalized, fantastic version of Aristotle. Now, in the age of mass media, and especially the internet, where any message has the potential to reach masses of people, I think such reductive approaches possess a seductive allure, especially if we conceive of the cultural struggle as being a war. We see that this video or that trend or this or that celebrity spreading a false message is becoming more and more popular. We see YouTube hit counters ticking over into the hundreds of thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of views. We see this odious and idiotic tweet garnering countless likes and retweets, or that Facebook post being shared over and over and over again. And we feel that we must combat these numbers with producing or attaining our own. That alarms start blaring in our minds, and we hear sort of, in not words, but shouts of, they're beating us, they're winning, we're losing, they're gashing us. And so we think that we have to respond in kind. But I'm here to say that that's not true. I'm here to say that the battlefield of those who are waging war on the truth is itself a kind of fantasy. It's a kind of putting forward this idealized or romanticized or somehow or another seemingly better way of being than the world in which we actually live, and drawing people into it. And I think to engage those who are against the truth, to engage them in a combative manner, is to step onto that battlefield of fantasy, to have to use their weapons which rely upon that same seduction into a fictionalized way of living, a romanticized way of living, rather than to draw people towards understanding the truth about the good. To use weapons which aim at the lower rather than the higher faculties of the human being. And I think this is an abuse of the influence of objective causality. Now, you might say, oh, well, if we don't do something, we're going to lose people. People are going to be, sucked into this fantastic way of thinking, this fantasy-driven way of life. And it's possible, right? I mean, that's a choice that people can make on their own. But at the same time, I think there's an kind of irrational and thoughtless worry there, because the weapons of fantasy cannot reach the high ground of the higher faculties. That is, we can be dissuaded from pursuing more thoughtful ways of living by engaging in lower forms of behavior. But the lower forms of behavior can never themselves disrupt our ability to choose the higher good, to pursue the thing that is known as the true good. So I think rather than focusing on this battlefield of lower faculties, or on this battlefield of fantasy, we ought instead to focus much more energy, much more time, much more of our attention on pursuing the perfection of the higher faculties. And so that's why I say that the metaphor of the culture war is rather inapt, because it sucks us into a battle that we cannot possibly win. There is no winning, and even every little victory that you have is one that is inevitably Pyrrhic in kind. It's one in which you perhaps gain the whole world and lose your own soul. So, as always, thank you for listening. I welcome any comments, questions, and feel free to explore the links below, and perhaps click on that Patreon one. Thank you.